When we think of that food that really elevated our mental capacity and the highest yield of fats, vitamins, and minerals, it came from bone marrow. Bone marrow is essentially the site of new red blood cell production. It's inside the bones of most mammals and birds. And the bigger the bone, the higher the yield of marrow. In most large mammals, bone marrow is found in the long leg bones or sternum in the hips, or any animal could yield bone marrow. Today, most bone marrow is extracted through cattle. However, for some of us, bone marrow is quite the treat, specifically in bison and elk and sheep and goats, caribou and even moose. But when we think about how we first came across bone marrow, it was very likely from scavenged kills from large predators. Early hominids didn't necessarily hunt and stalk game. They did eventually. The easiest way to get that high yield meal was to drive prey off of a kill, scavenge what they could, targeting that bone marrow as it was nutrient dense and full of fats. We didn't have claws, we didn't have fangs. We couldn't fly like a bird or swim as fast as a fish, but we did have a thinking brain. We had ingenuity and problem-solving skills. Bone marrow would have been a useful food source. And for those tool-using hominids, it was very easy for them to crack open bones, extracting that marrow for a quick and very effective meal. No cooking was needed to eat bone marrow, and it was eaten completely raw. I always think the bigger the animal, the bigger the bones, the greater yield of bone marrow. Now, studies have shown that bone marrow is far richer in vitamins and minerals than the actual meat of that animal. And the stem cells that are in bone marrow can actually help your body produce red and white blood cells. Do I personally think this was probably one of those key advantages into our evolution? By extracting nutrient-dense bone marrow, did that help us progress, grow our brains, live longer, and ultimately evolve into who we are today? Absolutely. And when we think about eating things raw, a lot of people ask, is bone marrow safe to eat? It is absolutely safe to eat raw. However, during modern times is where you can find the biggest problems with bone marrow and eating it raw. So the toxic chemicals and the heavy metals are the actual issue. And that's our own fault by introducing those into the landscape and then having our cattle and livestock graze on those sources. If you're hunting an animal, something like an elk or a moose or even a bison, you really have no worries about those toxins and those harmful chemicals getting into your system. The more wild and free range it is, the safer it is to eat that bone marrow raw. Now, Tel Aviv University, in collaboration with scholars from Spain, have actually uncovered evidence that bone marrow wasn't one of those things that was just immediately eaten. During that lower Paleolithic period, around 400,000 years ago, Neanderthals were taking the bones from kills, bringing them back to their caves, and actually storing those long bones for up to 9 weeks. Essentially, it was a form of food preservation. Now, the idea was very simply that in times where there was no food, for up to 9 weeks, crack open those bones, extract that bone marrow, and have a pretty vital meal. With a little bit of ingenuity, taking a rock, smashing a bone, you can extract that bone marrow and get a very vital nutrient-based source of food. Now, the researchers found that there was a large number of deer leg bones, and they could tell that they were smashed because of the remnants of the bones that they were found. More importantly, those bones, due to specific cut marks on those bones, they were stripped of all the flesh and membrane and really anything that could be on that bone that would potentially rot. So early people would kill an animal, strip it of its meat and all those kind of vital things that they wanted to consume, take those long leg bones, deflesh them, demembrane them, all that fascia, get rid of it all, bring it back to a cave, wrap it up in a hide, and actually preserve it. They had a long-term food source. In the recent bison butchering class that I did, this was actually something that we did. Myself and 8 other students fully butchered out a bison, removing the hide, all of the meat, and then pulling out those long leg bones, specifically the front legs and the back legs. Brought those back to our camp and broke them open to extract that marrow. Now, from the time that we butchered the bison to the actual marrow extraction, it was about 24 hours. So bone marrow can be eaten at a later date. More importantly, on my own adventures out in the bush, my dog Finn comes across leg bones all the time. And typically those leg bones, the lower leg bones of elk and mule deer, come from hunters. And I get it, most hunters, there's no real use for them aside from the long bones. Finn finds them, we crack them open, and we've eaten the marrow. I will say I don't know the exact time on when that bone was detached from the animal, but if it is rotten and it is smelly, that's probably not the best. But when it's cold, that marrow is going to preserve even longer. With a little thorough kind of investigation of it, I can ultimately draw those conclusions that it is safe to eat. Now, to give you a little comparison, these are actually some of the leg bone shards that came off when my students and myself were breaking open the leg bones of the bison. You can still kind of see there's a little pinkness to them. There's a little bit of flesh and membrane on there. But more importantly, this is what the archaeologists were trying to replicate. They could find these that are 400, 500,000 years old and then do a comparative break to see if they could kind of get these similar breaks. These right here, I'm going to turn into some sort of projectile point or some sort of tool. The break is very unique. It's less of a cut and more of a shattering or a breaking. These right here, fresh, maybe 3 weeks old. This bison leg bone here is 1 year old. Now, fresh bone is a lot harder to break compared to older bone. Just time has already gotten to it. If it is exposed to the elements, you can get some deterioration just from the weather, the sun, any number of things. But these have been sitting inside my trapper shack. I'm gonna give them a pop. I really wanna see, even if on an old bone, we can replicate some of these breaks here. Maybe my leg isn't the smartest place to do this, but let's give it a go. Kind of see already right there that break, that shard that's kind of coming off is almost identical to this, a little bit more rounded on this top one. Let's give it a little bit softer hit. There we go. That right there is old marrow and it stinks. Oh, that's nasty. Still has its soft feel, but being that this is old, it's very likely I'll be able to pull this out. Now, fresh marrow is white. It almost looks like a banana and almost has the same consistency of an unripe banana. It's a little kind of hard but soft, if you know what I mean. All right, there we go. That right there is a chunk of old marrow. You do not want to eat this. However, when melted, you can still use this for its fats. You could still make a candle out of it. You could still use it to, condition and protect any sort of metals. It is essentially oil that's been encased and kind of dried out inside this bone, but it is still usable from a survival standpoint. From the consumption standpoint, do not eat old marrow. It should come out white, almost like you took a banana, you cut the banana in half. It has a very whiteness, almost a pinkiness to it. You will find some marrow that is a little bit more yellow on fresh bones. That's safe to eat. Old marrow that is yellow, do not eat. It should be white on the inside. Ugh, that is wretched. All of this, and I'll continue smashing it, are going to wind up being eventual tools for me. I like to use bone tools, bone arrow points, needles, hooks, any number of things. But these bones are super thick. So not only in a fresh bone could you get the marrow, but you also have a great medium to build a variety of tools from. Kind of see a crack here, a crack there. Let's go right here and see if we can maybe get this long blade out. That'd be a cool bone knife. There we go. Let's get this. Let's continue the break right here. There we go. This is something that if you can replicate with fresh leg bones, all of that would be consumable in a fresh animal. Again, in a fresh animal. This side, as well as this side right here, great opportunities to make some tools. Old bones, do not eat the marrow. Fresh bones. And based on those archaeological finds, 9 weeks, maybe even 10 weeks was that kind of golden rule for folks living in that late Paleolithic period. So when we think about our early ancestors and the food sources that were available, before we really got into hunting with different projectile weapons or even throwing rocks or rabbit sticks, it was very likely that early hominids drove animals off of large kill sites specifically to target that bone marrow. If you take something like a wild horse or a camel or a deer, let's go something even as large as a mammoth. You imagine the size of that marrow chunk that's on the inside, that is all fats, all minerals, and all vitamins. Not only is it going to help them fuel their bodies, it's very likely that if we didn't extract that bone marrow, we could be something completely different today. I would say that bone marrow extraction was one of the key things, one of the key survival skills that early hominids did to ultimately get the biggest bang for their buck. If it wasn't for that bone marrow, our futures could have turned out completely different. Based on that archaeological evidence, it was actually stored and consumed at a later date during those times when food was scarce. All right, that's some bone marrow for you. Absolutely delicious. Don't overlook it. Appreciate you watching.